Today, we will look at a couple of recent approaches to compatibilism. The core idea of compatibilism is to show why free will is the kind of thing that really doesn't butt heads with determinism. The idea is that what it takes to have free will doesn't demand indeterminism. It doesn't demand that determinism is false. As we saw in the previous lecture, classical compatibilism develops a particular kind of answer to this. It gives an answer to the question, what is free will, such that it doesn't require determinism. However, the account that they develop has a number of problems, one of which is it doesn't explain how humans are morally different than hedgehogs. But most of us assume that people have a kind of free will and moral responsibility that hedgehogs just don't and never will. So this is one of the factors, this difference between humans and other animals, that leads to a new framework for compatibilism. The new framework was developed and presented by Harry Frankfurt, who is a philosopher at Princeton University. Frankfurt's actually enjoyed some broader publicity of late. As far as I know, he's the only philosopher to appear on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. Although this wasn't prompted by his work on free will, rather it was upon the publication of his tiny book entitled On Bullshit. For some reason, the media was more interested in that than they were in his work on free will. Even though this tiny book is what got him the gig on The Daily Show, what has made him a major figure in philosophy is not that work, it's his work on free will. He begins his compatibilist account by arguing that one important difference between humans and other mammals is the fact that humans can have desires about our desires. That's the core idea. It turns out it's a little bit complicated, so I'm going to go through it pretty slowly. So humans are capable of these kinds of complex mental states, desires about desires, and Frankfurt calls these second-order desires. So most of the time, I want to eat expensive ice cream. That just happens to be a fact about me. Most of the time, I want to eat expensive ice cream. That's a first-order desire. Even though I have this desire to eat ice cream, it's also true that most of the time, I wish I didn't want that. I wish I didn't want to eat ice cream all the time. That desire is an example of a second-order desire. So I have this low-level desire to eat ice cream, and then I have a higher-order desire that says, no, bad desire, I don't want that desire. Frankfurt says that less sophisticated animals, like cats and dogs, can presumably have first-order desires, like the desire to eat. The cat wants to eat the fish that I'm preparing for dinner, say. But cats and dogs probably can't have anything so sophisticated as second-order desires. No cat thinks, I really wish I didn't want to eat that fish. That's not the kind of thing that a cat is capable of. Second-order desires come in several different versions. So one is a second-order desire can be a desire not to have a desire that you do have. That's like the example of my desire for ice cream. I had the second-order desire that I not have that desire. I wish I didn't have that desire. Alternatively, though, a second-order desire can be a desire to acquire a desire that you don't have. Like, I don't have the desire to exercise, and I wish I did. So that's an example of a second-order desire. My desire to have a desire to exercise. Or a second-order desire can be a desire that one of your competing first-order desires beats another one. So let's say I have the desire to diet and the desire to eat ice cream. And these two desires are battling it out. But then I can step back and say, well, I want my desire to diet to defeat the other desire. I want the desire to diet to win out and be the desire that guides my behavior, that produces the action. This capacity of ours, Frankfurt says, is what allows us to evaluate ourselves in a reflective way, that we can think about ourselves, we can step back and think about what we desire and whether we want to continue desiring it. He uses this notion of second-order desires about our desires, to provide a novel account of free will. He says that a person has free will just in case the first-order desire that he wants to have is effective. Now, he uses the term will here. So he says when a first-order desire is effective, he calls that the will. And this will turn out to be something that allows him to make a clever point later. It sounds really technical so far, but the core idea is roughly that a person has free will if he acts on the desire that he wants to win. So return to my desires to diet and my desire to eat dessert, say. I have a second-order desire that favors my desire to diet, but I don't have any such second-order desire in favor of eating dessert. When I think about my desires, I fully say to myself, I hope that my desire to diet prevails. I hope that that desire wins out and crushes the desire to eat dessert. According to Frankfurt, if I'm successful, if that desire to diet prevails, then I have enjoyed an episode of free will. That's what it is to have free will. The desire that I want to have really is effective. Now, as I said, Frankfurt uses this term will in a special way. He uses the term will to mean a desire that is effective in producing behavior. So when he says that you have a will, what he means is, well, that means, so let's say I have the will to diet. That means that my desire to diet was effective in guiding my behavior. That makes it, that desire, my will. And this allows him to state his view about free will in a kind of pleasing way. He says, you have free will if you have the will that you want. In the diet case, I want my desire to diet to win out. I want that desire to be my will, my effective desire. If my desire to diet does win out, then I got the will I wanted, and that means my will was free. To illustrate this further, Frankfurt uses an example of two different kinds of drug addicts. Both addicts want to take the drug. One of the addicts, though, the willing addict, doesn't think the drug is doing him any harm. He is completely on board. He loves the drug, and he loves loving the drug. He wants to take the drug. He wants to take the drug. He is all in for this drug. The other addict, Frankfurt calls the unwilling addict, is deeply conflicted. He wants to take the drug on the one hand, but he also wants to stop taking the drug. When he steps back and thinks about this, he says to himself, well, I know I want the drug, but I also know I don't want the drug. He says to himself, I really hope my desire not to take the drug, my desire to quit, I hope that desire wins. So he has these two competing desires, the desire to take the drug and the desire to quit. And he steps back from that and says, what I really want out of those two is I want the desire to quit to win out. I want that to be my effective desire. Now, Frankfurt says, if the willing addict's desire for the drug wins out, in this case, this is the willing addict, the one who wants the drug to win out. If that's his effective desire, then he enjoys free will. So the guy who wants to take the drug and wants to take the drug and is completely in favor of the drug, if he takes the drug, then that's an episode of free will. So the unwilling addict presents a more interesting kind of set of possibilities. So he wants his desire to quit to win out. So if his desire to quit does win out, then he exhibits free will. He got the will that he wanted. He wanted his desire to quit to win. But what if his desire for the drug wins out? Then Frankfurt says he doesn't have free will, for he's being driven by a desire that he doesn't want to be effective. He's being driven by a desire that he wants not to guide his behavior. Susan Wolf, a philosopher at the University of North Carolina, characterizes this sort of view as what she calls a real self theory. Because if I say to myself, I want my desire to diet to win out, what I'm saying is that's who I really am. I really am the person who wants to diet. I'm not really the person who wants to eat the dessert. That the desire to diet reflects the real me, the real self. And so the unwilling addict identifies himself with his desire to quit, not his desire to use. He thinks, my desire to quit, that reflects the real me. My desire to use is something else. It's something outside of the real me. It's only through our capacity for reflection, Frankfurt would say, that we're capable of identifying with our real self. The idea is that when the addict says, that's not who I really am, what I am most deeply is reflected in my desire to quit. He's saying, that's my real self, and I can stand back and recognize that that's my real self. So Frankfurt sometimes says that our will is free when our action comes from a desire with which we wholeheartedly identify. And that's kind of a key notion in his philosophy, that this idea of wholeheartedness, that I'm entirely on board with this desire causing my action. I step back and I say, that desire to quit taking the drug, that's the one I want. I wholeheartedly embrace it because that's the real me. On Frankfurt's theory, a critical component of moral responsibility is whether a person identifies with their action and the motives behind it, as we've seen. What matters for moral responsibility is that the person identifies with the desire. They think that it reflects their real self. That's what's key to free will and moral responsibility. And there's a recent study that suggests that this really is important to the way people, ordinary people, think about moral responsibility. In an experiment by Rob Woolfolk, John Doris, and John Darley, they presented adults with a scenario in which two married couples were traveling together, and one of them, Bill, discovers that his wife is having an affair with the other man, Frank. On their flight home, the plane is hijacked, and Bill is ordered by the hijackers to kill Frank. There were two conditions. In both conditions, the hijackers order Bill to kill Frank, and Bill does it. But in the two different conditions, they varied whether or not Bill wanted to kill Frank, whether or not Bill identified with the desire to kill Frank. In one condition, it says Bill was upset that Frank cheated on his wife, but he didn't want to kill him. In the other condition, Bill thinks, roughly, terrific, now I have the perfect excuse to kill Frank, which I really, really want to do. People who were told that Bill really wanted to kill Frank rated Bill's action as much more blameworthy than people who were told that Bill really didn't want to kill Frank, but he felt like he had to because the hijackers were forcing him. And this suggests that people really do find identification to be an important factor in evaluating how responsible someone is. And that, of course, fits with Frankfurt's theory of free will beautifully. Frankfurt's account of free will is compatible with determinism, as it would have to be a compatibilist theory, but Frankfurt maintains that it avoids some of the standard problems that have afflicted classical compatibilism. So if you'll recall, classical compatibilism treats freedom as being able to do what you want, roughly. That, according to Frankfurt, is freedom of action, not freedom of will. So recall that on classical compatibilism, the focus is on whether my action is constrained. Am I prevented from acting in a way that differs from the way that I do? Am I prevented from acting in the way that I want to? Hume, remember, characterizes this by putting the question, am I a prisoner in chains? And if the answer is no, then I pretty much have free will. So it's being able to perform an action that makes you free on the classical view. Frankfurt says, no, that's not it. What you're interested in is not freedom of action. That's not what the problem is. The problem is about freedom of will, freedom of being able to exercise the will that you have. So he focuses on whether or not you can have the desire or the will that you want. So the freedom to have the will that you want, that's the idea that distinguishes it from the classical views. Nonetheless, Frankfurt's account is consistent with determinism, because what matters for free will is just that you act on the desire that you identify yourself with. And determinism is perfectly consistent with that. So the reason that you identify with a particular desire, say the desire to kick the drug, might itself be determined. But Frankfurt says that's irrelevant to whether or not the desire you identify with is effective. Let's go back to the example of Bill killing Frank on the plane. It might be that deterministic forces led Bill to the point where he wholeheartedly endorsed killing Frank, when that was the thing that he most wanted to do. But if he identifies with that action and the motive behind it, then Frankfurt says his will is free, regardless of whether he was determined to wholeheartedly identify with his desire to kill Frank. So all that matters, according to Frankfurt, is do you identify with the desire that is effective? If you do, then you count as having free will. If the reason you identify with that desire can be traced back in a deterministic way, that doesn't matter. That doesn't make a bit of difference to whether or not you were free or responsible. And that's how his account is consistent with determinism. In addition, Frankfurt thinks that his account can address all of the shortcomings that I mentioned in the last class about classical compatibilism. So, although hedgehogs and dogs and cats and rats and toads can have freedom of action, that is, they can do what they want, they lack freedom of will. because they lack the capacity to reflect on their desires and decide which one they most identify with. So, dogs and cats don't have the critical resources to make those kinds of judgments and those kinds of evaluations. And part of what seems really nice and sort of satisfying about this view is that it taps into the idea that our capacity for reflection is important for our free will. For animals, non-human animals, there probably is this competition between different desires. The dog wants to eat and it also wants to go outside. And the natural way to model this is just the simple weighing function we saw with Hobbes in the last lecture. Just the dog wants to go outside, it wants to eat, and it weighs those, and it weighs the options and the timing, and then the scales just determine the choice. But Frankfurt's point is that when we humans, and maybe dolphins and chimpanzees, he doesn't care about any of that stuff, but humans as opposed to lower mammals, humans can do something that's really elevated. We can step back from the brute conflict between our desires, the simple weighing of desires. We can step back and reflect on which motive we really want to follow. And that lifts us up above the simple, crude battle of our base desires. That lifts us out of the kind of animalistic fight that you see in the weighing model that applies to dogs and cats and hedgehogs. In the last lecture, we saw that another objection to classical compatibilism was the locked door problem. So, according to classical compatibilism, an action counts as free only when the person could have done otherwise if he had so desired. But in the case of the Seinfeld fan, he was locked in the room. He couldn't have gotten out if he had so desired, so he didn't count as free. But Frankfurt would say here, well, obviously the guy was free. The Seinfeld fan freely chose to be callous, and so he's responsible for it. Frankfurt's theory gives us the right answer here. He can say the Seinfeld fan wasn't free to leave the room, but he was free to have the will to leave the room. He was free to want to leave the room and to want that desire to be effective. Nothing prevented him from that. And that means he has free will, and that's the basis for his moral culpability. The third problem with classical compatibilism that we saw last time is the problem of compulsive behavior. And that might be the most important problem for the view. Classical compatibilism only attends to external constraints. It only asks, was the person in chains effectively? But people with compulsions seem to have diminished freedom and responsibility. People with OCD who can't stop washing their hands, or kleptomaniacs who are compelled to steal, people who are addicted to drugs who want to quit and apparently can't. In at least some of these cases, we want to be able to explain how it could be that they have diminished free will and responsibility. But the classical compatibilism has no way to deal with this because they only focus on external constraints. Frankfurt's account takes the issue of free will into the head, into the mind, and it can address the problem. So what Frankfurt can say is that people acting under internal compulsion lack freedom of will because they don't have the will that they want. So the person with OCD wants to wash his hands, but in many cases at least, he ardently wishes that he didn't have that desire and that desire was not guiding his behavior. And so that's the sense in which he doesn't have free will. Sure, his desire to wash his hands is effective, but he doesn't identify with that desire. This account of free will also explains why free will is something that we should care about. After all, Frankfurt says, on his account, to have free will is to get something you want. You have free will when the desire that you care most about is effective. So if I want my desire to diet to win out, and that desire does win out, then I am getting something that I really want. And in getting that, I'm enjoying free will. So of course that's something I would value. It satisfies something that I really want. Although Frankfurt's account is attractive in many ways, there are significant problems. On his account, you have freedom of will only when you get to have the will that you want. But that means that whenever we act on the basis of desires that we don't want to have, we aren't acting freely. But many immoral actions, like marital infidelity, seem to have this character. That is, presumably in many cases, the cheater thinks, I wish I didn't have such a strong desire for extramarital dalliances. Frankfurt's account suggests that If they're not identifying with their desire to have extramarital affairs, then they're not really free. But it's unlikely that a spouse would say, oh, well, as long as you didn't want to have that desire, then that's fine. As long as you didn't want to cheat on me, that's cool with me. I think that would be a weak excuse in most people's eyes. Susan Wolf raises a more pervasive problem for these sorts of views. Sometimes people get manipulated into having the second-order desires, or more generally, the real self that they have. For example, this might happen through brainwashing, maybe in cults. In cults, people's entire value systems can get distorted by the indoctrination of cult leaders. Wolf illustrates this broader worry with the story of Jojo, son of the evil dictator Joe I. Jojo's father carefully trains his son to have the evil character that he himself has. He trains Jojo to revel in cruelty and to relish torture. All of this is totally beyond Jojo's control. He's just a baby. He's just a little baby and then a boy who's been manipulated into an evil heir apparent. Moreover, since Frankfurt's account is compatibilist, all of this process, all of the entire process could be completely determined. But now, Jojo has a repugnant real self, a repugnant set of second-order desires. He wants his desires for cruelty to win out. He's a terrible person. But Wolf says, we want to say it's not Jojo's fault. It was all down to Joe I. Frankfurt's theory would have to allow that Jojo has free will. At least in many cases, as long as he's having the desire that he wants to have, he would have free will. But it seems intuitively like in many of these cases, the individual's not free. And the problem here is really a version of a deep problem that haunts most compatibilist accounts. A person who has a despicable real self might only have that real self because he was manipulated into having it. And at least many people don't want to say that the person is fully responsible for his actions, even if his character was imposed on him. After all, a person can be manipulated against their will, and if they're manipulated through no fault of their own to have a malicious real self, then it seems like we want to be able to exculpate them. But Frankfurt's approach says, so long as the person acts in a wholehearted way, so long as they identify with their actions and motives, then they're responsible and free, regardless of how those attitudes came about. And that seems kind of harsh to a lot of philosophers. Interestingly, Frankfurt bites the bullet. He says, well, if someone, let's call him David, gets manipulated into having a completely different character, even if the manipulation was out of his control, we now need to address that character. We need to evaluate the character that David has now. So it's perfectly appropriate, Frankfurt says, to continue the same as if he hadn't been manipulated. And this has seemed to many to be a major cost of such a theory, and it's one reason even Frankfurt's sophisticated compatibilism isn't entirely satisfying. Over the last 30 years, Frankfurt-style approaches have become more and more sophisticated. But there's a recent movement that approaches this issue of compatibilism and incompatibilism in a much more flat-footed way. Incompatibilists rely heavily on the idea that incompatibilism is intuitive. It's the natural, everyday way of thinking about things. In fact, that's the primary reason that's offered for why we should be incompatibilists. But recently, a group of philosophers who call themselves experimental philosophers have started exploring whether or not people really do think this. So Eddie Namias, a philosopher at Georgia State University, and several colleagues argued that if incompatibilists really think that the reason to believe in incompatibilism is because it's intuitive, that it's the normal view, then they thought, well, maybe we should ask people? So they constructed various scenarios that describe determinist universes and then asked the people, these were all non-philosophers, questions about whether people in those scenarios were free and responsible. So they gave them a series of different questions, a series of different scenarios, but I want to focus on one. They emphasize in this scenario that everything that happened in the universe that they're describing could be predicted by a supercomputer. And then they ask questions about free will. So let me read the entire passage to you. So the subject's got this. Imagine that in the next century we discover all the laws of nature and we build a supercomputer which can deduce from these laws of nature and from the current state of everything in the world exactly what will be happening in the world at any future time. It can look at everything about the way the world is and predict everything about how it will be with 100% accuracy. Suppose that such a supercomputer existed, and it looks at the state of the universe at a certain time on March 25th, 2150 AD, 20 years before Jeremy Hall is born. The computer then deduces from this information and the laws of nature that Jeremy will definitely rob Fidelity Bank at 6 p.m. on January 26, 2195. As always, the supercomputer's prediction is correct. Jeremy robs Fidelity Bank at 6 p.m. on January 26, 2195. As I said, they gave this scenario to a bunch of undergraduates, and they asked them a variety of questions about free will and responsibility. And to the surprise of many incompatibilists, what they found was that most people said Jeremy should be blamed for his actions. Jeremy was blameworthy for robbing the bank. And so incompatibilists would have thought, well, this is a deterministic universe, so people should say that Jeremy's not morally responsible. So this looked like a problem for incompatibilists, that a person who behaves badly in a deterministic universe still gets accused of being morally blameworthy. So this is not yet the end of the story, though. A couple of philosophers who were sympathetic to incompatibilism complained that the description of determinism here is really complicated. In addition, it emphasizes the predictability of the person's behavior. And you might think that predictability is less disturbing to people than causal inevitability. Indeed, as we've seen in this course, the problem that God knows everything that we're going to do seems like it's somewhat less threatening than the idea of causal determinism. There are ways to come to terms with the idea that your actions are predictable that are not available if the question is, what if your actions are causally dictated by the past? So in a subsequent experiment, researchers gave participants what was supposed to be a simpler description of determinism that focused on the idea of causal inevitability. And that text went as follows. Imagine a universe in which everything that happens is completely caused by whatever happened before it. This is true from the very beginning of the universe, so what happened in the beginning of the universe caused what happened next, and so on, right up until the present. For example, one day, John decided to have French fries at lunch. Like everything else, this decision was completely caused by what happened before it. So, if everything in this universe was exactly the same up until John made his decision, then it had to happen that John would decide to have French fries. After reading this description, participants were asked whether people in this universe are morally responsible. And most people in this case said no. And that's exactly what the incompatibilist expected to hear. The incompatibilist prediction was, if you give people a simple description of determinism that emphasizes that the outcomes are causally inevitable, that they have to happen, then people will be much more reluctant to say that those individuals whose actions are determined are fully morally responsible. Now, of course, this isn't the end of the story. Experimental philosophers continue to develop studies to figure out exactly what people think about these kinds of scenarios and exactly what kinds of changes in the descriptions affect how they think about it. Moreover, the entire enterprise of experimental philosophy is itself controversial, since it diverges so far from the traditional approach in philosophy, which is solitary toil in the armchair. But experimental philosophy has been one of the most widely discussed developments in the contemporary debate over compatibilism. Compatibilism is the rosiest of pictures about free will. Everything is going to be fine, don't worry about determinism. In the next lecture, we'll consider a diametrically opposed reaction to the problem of free will. We'll look at philosophers who say everything is not fine, compatibilism is a ridiculous patch that fails to acknowledge the real problem, and that ultimately the right conclusion is that free will is an illusion.